1936, Fisherman's Bend, Port Melbourne, a sandy paddock next to Port Phillip Bay, 140 acres of nothing. 6 years later, the largest aircraft factory in the Southern Hemisphere. Wirraways, boomerangs. Pratt & Whitney Wasp engines built under licence at the same plant. 755 aircraft rolling out of one hangar to defend Australia when Britain could not. The Commonwealth Aircraft Corporation, founded by BHP's Essington Lewis and Sir Lawrence Wackett. 1,700 aircraft in total. 49 years of continuous manufacturing on the same sandy paddock. Then in 1985, Hawker de Havilland absorbed CAC. In 2000, Boeing swallowed Hawker de Havilland. Today, Lorimer Street makes composite trailing edges for Boeing 787s assembled in South Carolina. The empire that designed whole aircraft now makes wing parts for someone else's plane. Not one Australian design. How does Australia's greatest engineering empire become a Boeing subcontractor? Before we go any further, if you want to keep these stories alive, I've created a book with the complete Australian lost factories. The workers, the gates, the Australian made, all gone. The link is on the first line of the description. Back to the story. Chapter 1. The Sandy Paddock, 1934. Essington Lewis boards a steamer bound for Europe, the United States and Japan. Chief General Manager of the Broken Hill Proprietary Company, BHP, the largest industrial company in Australia. Bourne Borough, South Australia, 13th of January, 1881. 53 years old. Over the next 12 months, Lewis toured Britain, Germany, the United States and Japan. He watched the German Luftwaffe rearming under Hitler. He watched the Japanese naval and industrial mobilization. He watched the Royal Air Force expanding, slowly. He returned to Melbourne in 1935, convinced of two things. War was coming, and Britain could not defend Australia. Lewis began lobbying immediately, not for a government defence contract, for a private Australian aircraft industry. He believed BHP had a national duty. The steel to build aircraft, the engineering culture to design them, the industrial base to produce them at scale. Australia had none of these yet. Australia had to build them. January 1935, Lewis convened his first syndicate meeting with Broken Hill Associated Smelters. He found key allies in W.S. Robinson of the Zinc Corporation and Lawrence Hartnett of General Motors Holdens. Over the following 18 months, Imperial Chemical Industries, Electrolytic Zinc and Orient Steam Navigation joined the founding consortium, 6 of the largest industrial companies operating in Australia. 17th of October 1936. The Commonwealth Aircraft Corporation Proprietary Limited was incorporated in Melbourne. Authorised capital £1 million, paid up capital £600,000. 6 shareholders, BHP 200,000, Broken Hill Associated Smelters 150,000, Imperial Chemical Industries 90,000, General Motors Holdens 60,000, Electrolytic Zinc 50,000, Orient Steam Navigation 50,000, Chairman Essington Lewis, Manager Lawrence Wackett. Meanwhile in London, the British trade press magazine The Aeroplane, closely tied to the Society of British Aircraft Constructors, greeted the announcement with what the RAAF Air Power Development Centre later described as, quote, editorials of scorn and sarcasm. The Empire was not amused. Australia was not meant to build aircraft. Australia was meant to buy them from the Empire. Lewis bought 140 acres on Lorimer Street, Fisherman's Bend, from the Victorian government. Sandy Paddock, an empty airstrip, 2 blocks from Port Phillip Bay. April 1937, construction began. September 1937, 5 months later, the aircraft factory, engine factory, light metal foundry and administration block were complete. The sandy paddock was gone. Chapter 2. The Two Men. Two men built the Commonwealth Aircraft Corporation. Essington Lewis, born Burra, South Australia, 13th of January, 1881. Adelaide School of Mines, BHP Chief General Manager by 1921. Chairman from 1950. Director General of Munitions for the Australian Wartime Government from 1940. Director General of Aircraft Production from 1942. In 1943, King George VI made him a Companion of Honour, one of the highest civilian awards in the Commonwealth. Lewis accepted the CH but refused a knighthood, died at Tallarook, Victoria, 2nd of October 1961. 80 years old, his most quoted maxim, verbatim, "Accountants can prove that nothing is possible." Sir Lawrence James Wackett, born Townsville, Queensland, 2nd of January 1896. Duntroon Military College graduate, Australian Flying Corps combat pilot on the Western Front, 1915 to 1919. Distinguished Flying Cross, 1918. RAAF officer from 1921. Ran the RAAF experimental station at Randwick, where he designed, built and flew his first aircraft in 1924. The Randwick station was closed in 1929 on the recommendation of visiting RAF Air Marshal Sir John Salmond. Wackett resigned from the RAAF in protest. He blamed the Society of British Aircraft Constructors for the closure, the same London-based body whose trade press magazine would sneer at CAC 7 years later. Wackett bought Tugan aircraft at Mascot, Sydney, designed the Widgeon flying boat, the Warrigal, the Kodak, the Gannet. In 1936, Lewis's CAC syndicate paid Wackett £15,000 for Tugun, buying not just the company, but Wackett himself and his engineering team. CAC's manager from October 1936, Chief Technical Advisor to the Commonwealth's Aircraft Advisory Committee from 1942. Knighted in 1954, in the words of the citation, in recognition of his outstanding pioneering services to the Australian aircraft industry in peace and war. Personal tragedy. Wackett's son, Squadron Leader Wilbur Lawrence Wackett, Bao fighter pilot with No. 31 Squadron RAAF, was killed in action in 1944. Sir Richard Williams, father of the RAAF and one of CAC's crucial early backers, wrote of Wackett verbatim. Here was a man who could take a clean sheet of paper, design an aircraft, supervise its construction and test it in the air. The number of people in the world who could do that could be counted on one's fingers. Wackett died St Leonards, Sydney, 18th of March, 1982, 86 years old. He lived long enough to see Hawker de Havilland begin negotiating for CAC. He died 3 years before the sale was signed. Chapter 3. Wirraway, 27th of March 1939. Fisherman's Bend. An aircraft rolls out of the corrugated iron hangar, silver, 2 seats, fixed tail wheel, wingspan 43 feet, serial number A20-3. The first Wirraway, Flight Lieutenant Hubert Boss Walker at the controls, takeoff into a westerly breeze. Circuit over Port Phillip Bay, landing. The first military aircraft ever built in Australia. Not just assembled, built. Designed under licence from the North American aviation companies NA-16 and NA-33. But built by Australian hands from Australian aluminium in an Australian factory. The name Wirraway comes from a Woiwurrung Aboriginal word meaning challenge. Read that again. The engine was Australian too, not just the airframe. Pratt & Whitney R1340 Wasp radial engine, 600 horsepower, 9 cylinders, built by CAC on the same Fisherman's Bend site. The first Australian-built Wasp had test run at CAC on the 21st of December 1938. 3 months before the first Wirraway airframe flew. Australia was, in 1939, the only dominion in the British Empire building both airframes and aero engines under one roof. 755 Wirraways built between 1939 and 1946. The last aircraft, A2757, a CA-16, delivered in July 1946. Roles: Advanced Trainer, Army Cooperation, Dive Bomber, and desperately, Frontline Fighter. Every RAAF pilot who trained at Point Cook, Uranquinty, Amberley, Wagga or Deniliquin between 1939 and 1946 flew the Wirraway. Every operational squadron in the Pacific flew Wirraways somewhere in their war record. The Royal Australian Navy retired its Wirraways in 1957. The RAAF's last Wirraway flew in 1959. CAC built the engines alongside the airframes. Wasp radials from the same Fisherman's Bend site that produced the Wirraway hulls. The Fisherman's Bend site by 1942 was a fully integrated aircraft and engine plant, the only site in the Southern Hemisphere doing both under one roof. An Australian aerospace supply chain from BHP steel to CAC engines to CAC airframes grew from the founding order. And then, on the 20th of January 1942, the aircraft that was never meant to be a fighter was ordered to fight. Chapter 4. Rabaul. 20th of January 1942. New Britain. Rabaul Harbour, No. 24 Squadron RAAF. Wing Commander John Leroux commanding, 10 Wirraways, 4 Hudsons. That was the entire air defence of the northern approach to Australia. Over 100 Japanese aircraft appeared over Rabaul. Mitsubishi A6M Zeros, Nakajima B5N torpedo bombers. Aichi D3A Val dive bombers. 8 Wirraways scrambled, 3 were shot down, 2 crash-landed, 1 was badly damaged, 6 aircrew killed, 5 wounded. Leroux signalled RAAF headquarters, in Latin, verbatim, Nos morituri te salutamus. We who are about to die salute you. The classical greeting of Roman gladiators to the emperor, sent in Latin from a burning New Guinea airfield by a RAAF wing commander who knew his squadron was about to be wiped out. The Wirraway was not a fighter. It was a trainer with a fixed-pitch propeller, twin Vickers machine guns and a top speed of 200 miles per hour. Against a 330 miles per hour, 20mm cannon, the Wirraway had no chance. But 11 months later, on the 26th of December 1942, near the Boona coast of Papua, a Wirraway did the impossible. Pilot officer John S. Jack Archer of No. 4 Squadron RAAF, with Sergeant J.L. Les Coulston as his observer and rear gunner, flying Wirraway A20-103. Archer spotted a Japanese fighter below him, a Nakajima Kai-43 Oscar of the 11th Sentai. Below him, lower altitude, slower climb. Archer dived, fired the forward Vickers guns. The Oscar went down. Archer radioed control verbatim as recorded in the RAAF operational report. Sir, I think I've shot down a 0. The response, verbatim, don't be silly, Archer, Wirraways can't shoot down zeros. But he had. It was later assessed as a Nakajima Kai-43 Oscar rather than Mitsubishi 0. But the point stood, a Wirraway had shot down a Japanese fighter. The only air-to-air victory of the Wirraway's entire war. Archer was awarded the United States Silver Star, presented on the 19th of January, 1943. Wirraway A20-103 sits today in the Australian War Memorial in Canberra, behind glass. Wing panels still intact. Jack Archer's aircraft. Chapter 5. Boomerang, 10th of December, 1941. 3 days after Pearl Harbor, Australia has no Spitfires, no Hurricanes, no modern fighter of any type. Britain has none to spare. The Commonwealth Aircraft Advisory Committee asks CAC, can you design and build an Australian fighter? Wackett and his team say yes. Chief designer, Fred David, Austrian. Born Vienna, 17th of January 1900. Jewish. Trained as an aeronautical engineer. Worked at Heinkel in Germany, designing military aircraft through the early 1930s. Later moved to Aichi in Japan, working on carrier aircraft, and reportedly contributed to the design of the Mitsubishi A5M and the Aichi D-3A Val dive bomber, the aircraft that would attack Pearl Harbor on the 7th of December 1941. By the late 1930s, David had escaped Japan for Australia, just before the war began. He arrived at Fisherman's Bend and Wackett hired him. Fred David, the Austrian Jew who had designed aircraft for both the Germans and the Japanese, who was now a technical enemy alien required to report weekly to Melbourne police under the national security regulations, sat at a drawing board at Fisherman's Bend in early 1942 and designed the fighter that would defend Australia from the Japanese aircraft his own drawings had helped create. 16 weeks. Drawing board to first flight. Built from Wirraway components, wings, centre fuselage, tail, undercarriage, plus a new forward fuselage and a Pratt & Whitney R1830. Twin Wasp radial engine built at Fisherman's Bend under licence. The RAAF ordered 105 CA-12 aircraft on the 2nd of February 1942 before the prototype had flown. First flight, 29th of May 1942. Test pilots Ken Fruin of CAC and squadron leader John Harper of the RAAF. They called it the Boomerang. 250 boomerangs built between 1942 and 1945. Two 20mm Hispano cannons and 4.303 Browning machine guns. Top speed 302 miles per hour. Combat service in New Guinea and Bougainville with No. 4 and No. 5 squadrons. No confirmed air-to-air victories, but the Boomerang was the most successful close air support aircraft the RAAF flew in the Pacific. Ground attack, target marking, forward air control for the Australian infantry advancing through Wau, Salamaua, Lai, Finschhafen and Bougainville. The Boomerang saved Australian ground troops. Fred David had designed a fighter for Australia in 16 weeks, from a country whose government told him to report to police every Wednesday. Chapter 6, Kangaroo. January 1943. War Cabinet approves prototype funding for a next-generation Australian fighter, CA-15, the Kangaroo. Design lead, Fred David again. Chief influence, captured Fokker-Wulf FW-190s from the European theatre. RAAF, specification 243. Approved June 1943. Engine after several changes. Rolls-Royce Griffon 61. V12 37 litre, 2035 horsepower, 4-bladed rotor propeller, teardrop bubble canopy, belly scoop radiator, empty weight 8,200 pounds. It looked like a Mustang. It was not a Mustang. It was Australia's answer to the Mustang. Here's the kicker. Also in 1943, Department of Aircraft Production Secretary Daniel McVeigh led an industrial mission to Britain and the United States. In the delegation, Wackett, RAAF officers. British Air Marshal Sir Ralph Sawley of the Royal Air Force pushed the mission toward the North American P-51 Mustang. And Wackett, the father of Australian aviation self-sufficiency, the man who had resigned from the RAAF in 1929 over British aviation supremacy, recommended that Australia license build the Mustang over developing his own CA-15. Read that again. The founder of the Commonwealth Aircraft Corporation, The designer who had made Australia self-sufficient in aircraft manufacturing recommended to War Cabinet in 1943 that Australia buy the American plane over building the Australian one. The reason was pragmatic. Wartime capacity was limited. The Mustang was proven. The CA-15 was speculative. Australia needed fighters now, not in 3 years. The reason was rational. It was also the moment Australian aviation surrendered. CAC built 200 Mustangs between 1945 and 1951, 80 CA-17 Mark 20s from the 29th of April 1945, and 120 CA-18 Mark 21, 22 and 23s. The CA-21, an additional 250 aircraft, was cancelled. 298 additional Mustangs were imported directly from North American. Meanwhile, the CA-15 languished. War Cabinet cancelled it in September 1944, reinstated in December 1944. Aircraft Advisory Committee reapproved in February 1945, but the industrial commitment was gone. Prototype A62-1001 finally flew on the 4th of March 1946. CAC test pilot Jim Schofield at the controls. Then, on the 25th of May 1948, Flight Lieutenant J.A.L. Archer, a different Archer from the Wirraway pilot 2 years earlier, took the CA-15 up over Melbourne. He climbed to 9,000 feet, then dived to 5,000 feet, levelled off. The airspeed indicator read 502.2 miles per hour, 808 kilometres per hour. Calibrated level flight speed was 448 miles per hour at 26,400 feet. The 502 miles per hour was a dive-derived figure, not sustained level flight, but it was still the fastest Australian-built piston-engine aircraft ever flown. In February 1950, Rolls-Royce recalled its 2 loaned Griffon engines. There were no spares, no production commitment, no RAAF order. The CA-15 was scrapped in 1950. 1 prototype built, never entered service. The fastest piston engine aircraft ever designed and built in Australia. Cut up for scrap. Chapter 7. Sabre, 1951. The Jet Age. The Korean War exposes the RAAF's Gloucester Meteor as outclassed by the Soviet MiG-15. CAC's own indigenous jet fighter project, the CA-23, is cancelled in 1953 after £163,000 of research and development spending. Instead, a licence to build the North American F-86 Sabre. AC extensively redesigns it. The Rolls-Royce Avon RA-7 engine replaces the General Electric J-47. Over 60% of the fuselage is redesigned to accommodate the Avon. The air intake is 25% larger. Only about 40% of the original F-86 structure survives the redesign. 2 30mm Aden cannons replace the 6 American .50 caliber machine guns. CAC test pilots called it the Avon Sabre. Everyone else called it the CAC Sabre. Prototype CA-26, serial A94101, first flew on the 3rd of August, 1953 at Avalon. Flight Lieutenant Bill Scott at the controls. On the 21st of August 1953, Scott took it supersonic in a shallow dive, the first Australian aircraft to break the sound barrier. 111 production CA-27 Sabres built between 1954 and 1961, plus the single CA-26 prototype. First production A94901 delivered on the 19th of August 1954. Service: ground attack sorties in the Malayan Emergency, 1958 to 1960, with No. 3 and No. 77 squadrons based at RAAF Butterworth, Air Defence at Ubon, Thailand, 1962 to 1968, with No. 79 Squadron during the Vietnam War, providing local air defence. Never engaged in air combat. 2 aircraft lost to engine failure, withdrawn from RAAF service in 1971. The Sabre worked. It was a good aircraft, but it was still a licence build, not an Australian design. Chapter 8. F-111. 24th of October 1963. Prime Minister Robert Menzies. Defence Minister Athol Townley. The Menzies government announces an order for 24 General Dynamics F-111C. Strike aircraft from the United States. Approximate cost $125 million US. Over the British TSR-2, over any local Australian option, which was never seriously considered. Air Marshal Sir Valston Hancock, the Chief of Air Staff who had led the RAAF procurement study and had initially favoured the North American A-5 Vigilante as an interim type while the F-111 was developed, was excluded from the final negotiations. The RAAF was excluded. Townley made the decision. The context matters. The F-111 was, in October 1963, still a paper aircraft. It had not yet flown. It had no operational service history. It was being developed for the United States Air Force under the TFX program, a joint fighter concept between the USAF and the US Navy that would eventually collapse when the Navy pulled out. The RAAF was buying an aircraft that did not exist yet. The F-111C would not enter RAAF service until 1973, 10 years late. Hundreds of millions of dollars over budget, plagued by structural, avionics and engine problems. Wings that cracked, fuel tanks that leaked, software that was late. It served until 2010. It was, when it finally worked, an outstanding strike aircraft, but the decision was made in October 1963. Australia would buy American strike aircraft, even paper ones, not build its own. CAC's Fisherman's Bend site was, in 1963, still the largest industrial engineering site in Victoria. It employed skilled tradesmen, fitters, turners, sheet metal workers, engine mechanics, trained across 3 decades of continuous aircraft production. Every one of them was, in industrial terms, made redundant to future Indigenous aircraft design by the F-111 order. CAC's response: the company that had built Wirraways, Boomerangs, Mustangs, the CA-15 prototype, Windshield trainers and Sabres, was to become a subcontractor. Mirage the 3 components, under Dassault, licence from 1964. 101 airframe shipsets and 140 ATAR engines. Aermacchi MB326H trainer under Italian licence from 1967. 97 aircraft, Bell 206B Kiowa helicopter under American licence. 56 aircraft, the last delivered in 1977. Comair bus bodies, 3,600 plus on Bedford and MAN chassis between 1946 and 1973, built to retain sheet metal workers between aircraft contracts. The last aircraft type wholly designed by CAC was the CA-25 Windshield. First flight, the 3rd of February 1951. 62 built, handed over on the 16th of September 1955 by Wackett personally to Air Marshal Sir John Macaulay. Every CAC aircraft after 1951 was a licence build or a component subcontract. Chapter 9. Hornet, 20th of October 1981. Malcolm Fraser Government, Defence Minister Jim Killen. Australia selects the McDonnell Douglas FAA-18 Hornet over the General Dynamics F-16 to replace the ageing Mirage 3 fleet, 75 aircraft, $2,788 million Australian dollars. The government aircraft factories at Avalon assembled 73 of the 75 locally. CAC built components. Both plants were kept busy, but no Australian design was even contemplated. By 1981, the Australian aviation industry existed only as a subcontractor to foreign primes. Design capability had been surrendered decades earlier in the 1943 Mustang Recommendation, in the 1953 Sabre Licence, in the 1963 F-111 order. The Hornet decision confirmed the pattern. Meanwhile, at Fisherman's Bend, CAC was joining the Australian Aircraft Consortium with GAF and Hawker de Havilland Australia to develop the A-10A-20 Wimmera military trainer. It was the last chance at an Indigenous Australian production aircraft since the Winjeel 30 years earlier. Prototype completed at the end of 1985, cancelled at the end of 1985. Never entered production. Never entered RAAF service. The Wimmera remains the last Australian-designed military aircraft prototype to have flown. And in July 1985, Hawker de Havilland Australia purchased CAC. Chapter 10. The Absorption, 1985. After 49 years of continuous aircraft production at Fisherman's Bend, the CAC board approves the sale to Hawker de Havilland Australia. Hawker de Havilland Australia traces to de Havilland Australia, established in Melbourne in March 1927 as de Havilland's first overseas subsidiary. Renamed Hawker de Havilland Australia in 1961 after the British Hawker Siddeley Group acquired de Havilland globally. British owned, Australian registered. The merger was reported in Engineers Australia magazine on the 31st of May 1985 as Hawker de Havilland, CACR to merge. The takeover occurred in July. Both companies were, at the moment of the merger, subcontractors to the government aircraft factories on the FA-18 Hornet program. Both were members of the Australian Aircraft Consortium developing the doomed Wimmera trainer. In 1986, the CAC name was retired. The Fisherman's Bend Company was renamed Hawker de Havilland Victoria. 49 years of Australian aircraft manufacturing under the Commonwealth Aircraft Corporation name ended. Only the physical factory continued. The name was gone. Here's the honest thing. Between the Wimmera cancellation at the end of 1985 and the 17th of October 2000, Hawker de Havilland Victoria at Fisherman's Bend built components for other people's aircraft, FA-18 Hornet components, Airbus wing components, Boeing components, Bombardier components, 15 years of subcontract work, no Australian design, no Australian type certificate, no CA anything. Then, on the 17th of October 2000, Boeing Australia Limited announced the acquisition of Hawker de Havilland from the Tenix Group. Tenix Managing Director Paul Salteri. Dollar value of the deal undisclosed, never publicly stated. Ken Peacock, Boeing Australia Executive Chairman, on the record verbatim. The acquisition of Hawker de Havilland is another milestone in the Boeing and Australia partnership that dates back more than 60 years. Milestone, the word he used. Not takeover, not consolidation, not the extinction of Australian sovereign aerospace design. Milestone. Boeing merged Hawker de Havilland with its already owned Aerospace Technologies of Australia, the former government aircraft factories, which Boeing had acquired via Rockwell in 1996. In 2009, the combined operation was renamed Boeing Aerostructures Australia. The name Commonwealth Aircraft Corporation had been dead for 23 years. Now the name Hawker de Havilland was dead too. Two names retired in 23 years. Two Australian aerospace lineages absorbed into a single Boeing subsidiary. The Fisherman's Bend site continues to make aircraft parts. The engineering culture continues in a diminished form. But the naming, Commonwealth. Australia's Commonwealth. The word Essington Lewis chose in 1936 to signal that this was a national aircraft industry, not a foreign subsidiary. That word was gone from the sign at the gate. Chapter 11. Lorimer Street, 2026. Walk to Fisherman's Bend, Port Melbourne. Lorimer Street. Boeing Aerostructures Australia at 226 Lorimer Street. Almost 1,000 employees per Boeing's own December 2024 backgrounder. Making 787 Dreamliner movable trailing edges using a resin infusion process developed in Victoria. Making 737 ailerons, rudders and winglets. Making 747 movable leading edges. Making 777 elevators, rudders and cove lip doors. All components shipped to the United States for final assembly. Not one aircraft rolls out of Fisherman's Bend today under its own power. The site the Victorian government sold to CAC in 1936 for 140 acres of sandy paddock now produces parts of aircraft that Australians will fly but not design. The February 2006 contract that put the 787 trailing edge at Fisherman's Bend was per Boeing's own backgrounder, valued at more than $5 billion over 20 years, the largest Australian aerospace contract in history. Real money, real employment, real Victorian composite technology. Also true, nothing designed in Australia. The trailing edge is a subcontract build. Australian engineers manufacture to Boeing's specification. They do not design the aircraft. They do not integrate it. They do not certify it. It is a wing part built for a jet that flies out of Everett and Charleston. The engineering talent at 226 Lorimer Street is world-class. The engineering authority is not. In 2022, the City of Melbourne nominated the former Government Aircraft Factories building at 226 Lorimer Street to the Victorian Heritage Register. State significance. One of only 2 Second World War aircraft assembly plants in Australia. Roughly 40% of the site is proposed for heritage listing. Not the whole site, 40%. Boeing's operations are explicitly protected. Meanwhile, the whole Fisherman's Bend precinct, 480 hectares, is being redeveloped by the Victorian Government as Australia's largest urban renewal project. By 2050, per the Fisherman's Bend framework, 80,000 residents and 80,000 jobs. Where the CA-15 flew, apartment towers, the RAAF Museum at Point Cook, 29 kilometres southwest of Lorimer Street, holds Boomerang A4630 and Sabre prototype A94101. Behind glass. Weekend visitors only. The Temora Aviation Museum in New South Wales, 500 kilometres north of Melbourne, flies Wirraway A2653 registered VHBFF. Boomerang A46122 registered VHMHR and Sabah A94983 registered VHIPN on weekend airshows, airworthy. Still flying 70 years after they rolled out of Fisherman's Bend. The Australian War Memorial in Canberra holds A2103. Jack Archer's Wirraway, the Oscar killer of December 1942, preserved, behind glass. No plaque at Lorimer Street for Essington Lewis. No plaque for Sir Lawrence Wackett. No plaque for Fred David, the Austrian refugee who designed Australia's first fighter in 16 weeks. No plaque for the 1,700 aircraft built at Fisherman's Bend. No plaque for the 755 Wirraways. No plaque for the 250 Boomerangs. No plaque for the CA-15 that flew at 502 miles per hour over Port Phillip Bay in May 1948 and was scrapped in 1950. The empire that designed whole aircraft now makes trailing edges for someone else's fuselage. Lesson 1. Corporate greed is not the only way an empire dies. The title of this video says corporate greed destroyed the Commonwealth Aircraft Corporation. That is the phrase that gets clicks, and the truth is more complicated. The industrial South Channel has told the stories of many Australian factories killed by foreign takeovers. Chrysler killed by Mitsubishi. CleanMade killed by the Young family's fraud. Nilex Esky sold to a Kansas subsidiary of an Atlanta parent. Sunbeam destroyed by Chainsaw Al Dunlap's SEC settled accounting fraud. The pattern is clear: American, British, Japanese and European boardrooms extracting value from Australian labour and Australian brands. Commonwealth Aircraft Corporation is different. There was no Chainsaw Al, no Iacocca, no Andrew Young. Hawker de Havilland's 1985 acquisition of CAC was an industry consolidation, not a fraud. Boeing's 2000 acquisition of Hawker de Havilland was a normal aerospace industry consolidation, not an asset strip. Ken Peacock is not a criminal. Paul Salteri is not a criminal. The men who signed the sale papers were, by the standards of their industry, doing their jobs. The Australian government is the villain. 6 decades of federal defence procurement decisions. The 1943 Mustang recommendation to War Cabinet. The 1953 Sabre licence. The 1963 F-111 order, the 1981 FA-18 selection, hollowed out CAC's design capability long before Hawker de Havilland could absorb it. By the time the corporate takeovers happened in 1985 and 2000, there was nothing left to steal. The industry had been stripped bare of design work by our own defence policy. The corpse was handed to Boeing because the industry it had killed was no longer worth burying properly. Corporate greed is not the only way an Australian empire dies. Sometimes the Australian government does it first and hands the wreckage to a foreign corporate for a milestone press release. Lesson 2. The Founder. Can author The Surrender. Sir Lawrence Wackett is one of the towering figures in the history of Australian aviation. Duntroon graduate, Australian Flying Corps combat pilot in the First World War. DFC 1918. Founder of the RAAF Experimental Station at Randwick. Founder of the Commonwealth Aircraft Corporation. Chief Technical Advisor to Australia's wartime aircraft production. Knighted in 1954 for pioneering services to Australian aviation in peace and war. He was, according to Sir Richard Williams, one of the very few people on Earth capable of designing an aircraft from a clean sheet of paper. And in 1943, on a Department of Aircraft production mission led by Secretary Daniel McVeigh, with RAF Air Marshal Sir Ralph Sawley pushing the argument, Wackett recommended that Australia license build the North American Mustang over developing his own CA-15. The reason was rational. Wartime capacity was limited. The Mustang was proven. The CA-15 was speculative. Australia needed fighters immediately, not in 3 years. His concept had CAC license-build Mustangs for high-altitude work and continue the CA-15 for low-altitude work, but production capacity flowed only to the Mustang. The recommendation was practical. It was also the moment Australian aviation surrendered. The father of Australian aviation self-sufficiency was, in this single instance, an author of its retreat. The CA-15 flew in 1946, hit 502 miles per hour in 1948, was scrapped in 1950 when Rolls-Royce recalled the loaned Griffon engines. Every subsequent Australian aircraft decision, Sabre in 1953, F-111 in 1963, FA-18 in 1981, and no fighter design attempted since, flowed from that 1943 recommendation. Founders are not gods. Founders make trade-offs. Sometimes the trade-off outlives the founder by 50 years and defines the industry after the founder is gone. Wackett died in 1982, 3 years before Hawker de Havilland bought CAC, 18 years before Boeing bought Hawker de Havilland, 44 years before the last CAC designed engineering culture at Fisherman's Bend gave way to the composite trailing edge shop. He never wrote publicly about whether he regretted the 1943 recommendation. His autobiography, Aircraft Pioneer, from 1972, does not dwell on it. But the tragedy is not that Wackett made a bad decision. It is that the pragmatic decision, once made, became a doctrine. Once Australia bought the Mustang licence, instead of pushing the CA-15 into production, the pattern was set. The pattern became policy. The policy became a 50-year retreat. And Wackett, who spent every other decision of his career fighting for Australian aviation sovereignty, was, in that one wartime moment, the man who signed the retreat order. Lesson 3. The aircraft survive. The country that built them does not. Wirraway 2103 is at the Australian War Memorial in Canberra behind glass. Jack Archer's aircraft, the Oscar Killer. Wirraway A2653 is at Temora Aviation Museum, airworthy, VHBFF, flies on weekend air shows. The engine still turns. The propeller still bites the air over central New South Wales. Boomerang A4630 at RAAF Museum Point Cook. Boomerang A46122 at Temora, airworthy, VHMHR. Sabre, prototype A94101 at Point Cook. Sabre A94983 at Temora, airworthy, VHIPN. Every surviving Commonwealth Aircraft Corporation airframe is documented, preserved, and in some cases still flying 70 or more years after it rolled out of the corrugated iron hangars at Fisherman's Bend. The aircraft survive. The country that built them does not. Not as an aircraft designing country. Not as a country that could take a clean sheet of paper, design a fighter, build the engines under license at the same plant, and put it into RAAF service. Not anymore. The Wirraway, the Boomerang, the CA-15 Kangaroo, the Winjeel, the Sabre, designed and built in Australia between 1939 and 1961, are the last generation of wholly Australian military aircraft. Every RAAF aircraft since 1963 has been either an imported foreign type or a license build of a foreign design. Boeing Aerostructures Australia at Fisherman's Bend makes wing components for aircraft designed in Seattle and assembled in South Carolina. The 787 trailing edge is beautifully made. Victorian composite technology, world-class quality, real employment for almost 1,000 Australians. But it is not an Australian aircraft. It is a wing part on someone else's plane. The engineering skill survived. The industry survived. The sovereignty did not. 1,700 aircraft, Fisherman's Bend, 1939 to 1985. The engineers still remember. The sandy paddock does not.